Beautiful Thursday to Talking Wellness. My name is Kayla Calafieri. I'll be hosting, and I am here with two incredible, inspirational, just amazing individuals that I've had the pleasure of speaking with prior to jumping on here for you all. And today, our podcast is actually going to be in honor of World Suicide Prevention Day, which is actually September 10th on Sunday. And I just wanted to start off before I introduce my two friends to the right and the left of me that suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. And according to the CDC, suicide deaths increased in 2022, rising from over 48,183 deaths in 2021 to an estimated 49,449 deaths in 2022, an increase of approximately 2.6%. These numbers are a sobering reminder of how urgent that it is that we further expand access to mental health care, address the root causes of mental health challenges, and recognize the importance of checking on and supporting one another. So I want to introduce my two friends who are here today, and they're going to share their experience, strength, and hope as it relates to suicide. And I'm going to start with Michael.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Marion, and I'm the father of Alexis Marion. Alexis died by suicide on February 24th of 2020. And since that time, I've become involved, educated, and continuing to educate myself and participate in what I can do to make a difference in other people's lives, as well as my own.
Thank you, Michael. And Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I'm a peer specialist at South Florida Wellness Network, but among many other things, I'm also a suicide attempt survivor. So that's why I'm here today to talk more about suicide prevention and awareness and education, and hopefully we can reach people that need to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think these conversations need to be had more. And so we're hoping today that we can bring, a message of hope, but then a call to action for those, because I think that as a community, we must rise together to support our loved ones and our neighbors and our friends that are struggling in silence. So Michael, my first question is for you. Losing a child to suicide it's an unimaginable pain. How has this experience impacted your life and your perspective on suicide?
It's impacted my life in every aspect because one thing that I learned very early on, when you lose someone to suicide, there's two calendars. There's a before calendar when Alexis was here and things were well, and then there's an after. And now that she's gone, her presence is ever missed in our home, in our neighborhood. Yeah. And you have to find a way to not move on, but move through this without them.
What does that journey look like for you, like moving through what has been like, I guess, kind of like the surrounding support that you've had to kind of get through, because, prior to this, we're talking about Alexis and just a beautiful, beautiful young lady, and I've gotten to hear a little bit about who she was. So what is it for you that helps you to move
Well, my
through?
biggest support is definitely my wife, Mary. Hey, Mary, you're going to watch this. And Jen, just building a community around people that knew Alexis. And one thing I must say, each and every day, I remember how Alexis lived, not how she died. And because of that, I'm able to try to make the best of the situations presented to me and develop relationships and cultivate the ones that I have and move forward in that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Stephanie, for you, how has your life changed since your suicide attempt, and what steps have you taken on your path to recovery?
So my life is completely different. So I had a lot of suicidal gestures and a lot of, I guess I would call them attempts, but I had like a major attempt, a genuine attempt when I was 18, so that was over 10 years ago. Today I'm in recovery from both mental health challenges and substance use disorder. So, 10 years ago I didn't plan on living. So just the fact that today, I have a very full, healthy life. Not that there's not struggles. Mm-hmm. Mental health challenges don't just go away. So, it's not without the struggles, but, I'm active in my recovery, which is, I think, is, what continues to get me to this point and why I'm still here. But it was a long journey for me. You know, just because that was maybe my last attempt doesn't mean there weren't other behaviors that could have ended in the same result. So yeah, it took a lot of therapy, medication. Like I tried everything. Some I didn't stick with, some I did, but there were a lot of steps between that. Addressing my substance use disorder was a huge part of it because for me, I can't really separate the two. My you know, my mental health challenges, and which ultimately lead to that, you know, the suicidal ideation and the attempts and the behaviors that follow. But my life is 100% different. I can't even like compare.
What would have been helpful, like, so during that time, because you said you were 18, like, if you had whoever was in your life at that time, you know, whatever relationships, loved ones, what could have been something that would have been helpful for them, you know, to, if they were identifying signs, were there signs? Like, what did that look like?
So now I can see like I guess I probably knew the signs at the time, but I was in the middle of it. Now the signs are very clear to me anyway. Looking back on where I was, the isolation, I spent so much time alone in my room in the dark. The substance use was a huge part of it. Self-harming behaviors. I self-harmed for many years, and that was, maybe those weren't like actual attempts themselves, but they were a part of the whole like darkness I was in. I just didn't want to talk to anyone. I was like really irritable all the time. You couldn't talk to me about anything. Withdrawn. I didn't do the things I used to do, like the things I enjoyed doing.
Yeah.
I always played sports. I stopped playing sports right before that, maybe a year before that. I just wasn't the same person. Like there were obvious changes, for sure.
What were some like key components to, I guess, like your recovery, or like, you know, thinking about like when I look at, because I have this image of you that's, you know, you're isolated, you're in this kind of downward darkness that you described. Like, what are steps that like a loved one could take if they're the ones that are seeing this, right? Like, what would have been helpful for you?
So I think it's hard to say like one thing because everyone's so different, because, you know, I had people that were there for me and supported me, but I wasn't open to it.
Okay.
But I think even with that, the education is crucial, what those signs mean, and the stigma around talking about suicide.
Yeah.
Because just because I had the thoughts doesn't mean I was always going to act on them. But if we pretend that the thoughts aren't real, that's not addressing it.
Yeah. So let's actually talk about that. You know, I want to talk about this misconception that talking about suicide actually leads to more suicide ideation. Can either of you kind of speak on that with regards to talking about it? Because I think people need to know. I think it's just it's a hard topic to talk about. I think for sure it makes anybody uncomfortable, but I feel like there's still this misconception that talking to somebody who may be having suicide ideation and asking them will actually lead to stronger feelings of suicide. What can you guys say about that?
Well, I'm speaking secondhand because, again, my experiences were through Alexis, not firsthand. She expressed to me that when she was able to talk to me about her feelings, whether it were ideations or past acts, she felt accepted. She felt comfortable in doing so. She never felt judged in our home. And I thought that was important for her to be able to say how she felt, whether it was something I wanted to hear or not. And I was able to do it without judging. So she taught me a lot.
That's beautiful right there. And I, Michael, I think that even for parents that are hearing this, like, how were you able to have those open conversations with your daughter, and like what kind of advice would you give to parents in those situations? Because I think what happens with parents is often they respond out of fear and they almost like shut down the whole conversation. And what's happening is now you're shutting down your child, and it may not be intentional because you're not trying to cause harm to your child, but in doing so, your child then feels more isolated, more unaccepted, more judged, and feels like they can't talk to anybody about their challenges.
Well, I think for me, it started once I was able to put my own biases and preconceived notions aside and realize not what was best for me, but what was best for her at the time that I was able to provide. and listening to her without judgment was something I was able to provide.
Yeah.
And she appreciated that. I know she did because she told me.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And I, even as a young person, I go back to, you know, times in my life where I struggled with suicide ideation, and I think that when we talk about things, we allow the burden to not be so much just on us. You know, it's almost this release where somebody can step into our pain and help carry us through. Stephanie, what about you? I mean, with that same kind of question.
So, you know, I don't blame my parents because there's no manual on what to do when your child is dealing with suicidal ideation or
Mhm.
self-harming behaviors. Like, there's no, this is what you need to do. So, you know, on their perspective or anyone like surrounding me, the perspective of like, I wouldn't have known what to do at the time
Right.
if it was someone like in my family or a loved one or friend. But we need to talk about it because
Yeah.
the reality is that, you know, mental health challenges are ongoing. They don't just stop and get cured. So if someone struggles with suicidal ideation, that doesn't just go away.
Yeah.
So maybe someone is doing much better and they're in a healthier place than they were, but doesn't mean the thoughts don't come. And if we're not talking about them and addressing them, then we're just harming people. People need a safe space to be able to talk about it because the reality is talking about it, like having a safe space to say, like, these are the thoughts I'm having. Like, maybe I don't want to act on them,
Mm-hmm.
but those are the thoughts that creates that open, non-judgmental space that's needed.
Right. And I think because even as a parent, like, it would be hard to have a conversation with your child if they're even, you know, having those thoughts. But I think this is why it's so important for parents to have their own support too, right? To get educated about this, to not go in it at it alone, because you're right, like this may be new territory, and in new territory, oftentimes we make mistakes, you know, and we're trying to do the best we can with the knowledge and awareness that we have. And so I think that's why I think for parents specifically that are having, you know, their young people that are struggling, what would you say is, you know, the best step that they can take in a preventative measure to get the support that they need in order to support their youth?
Well, again, speaking from my experience, that it's very difficult when your child tells you they don't want to be here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's a conversation I was never trained for, didn't understand when it happened. But Alexis let me know in no uncertain terms, I don't want to be here anymore. And then there were good days and there were bad days. So once I realized, okay, I'm dealing with something that wasn't in the rule book. Never saw this before. Yeah. What do we do? We've reached out to, and for parents that are dealing with their own issues and situation with their children right now, I would definitely ask for help. And then when you ask for help and you find those people that are willing to help you, whether professional, they have to be professional. But case in point, when I was first told that Alexis had suffered from depression and anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, I guess I know what that is. I really did not know what that is. And I later come to understand when somebody says it's like, this person has depression and anxiety, that's like saying I'm on 95. Where are you on 95? Are you in Florida? Are you in, where are you?
Yeah.
Help me understand where this depression and anxiety, what range we are in, what steps can we take to make it better, and how do I support my child? Because that's first and foremost the most important thing. And I didn't have those questions to ask at the time because I did not know.
Yeah. That just, it sounds like it's hard. Like that's like a really hard thing. And when you don't know, you know, we're all just doing the best that we can. And so I think that this is why, like, the education and talking about this and reaching out to those resources and having those professionals step in to support you through that. I mean, it's hard to go through anything alone, but let alone something like this. I also wanted to ask you, Stephanie, just so that you can share a little bit of the insight into, like, the emotional and mental struggles that you faced, you know, before your attempt and then even after, because I think sometimes, you know, suicide is like, it's spoken about and people lose their life, and it's a tragedy, but I don't think that we talk enough about, like, what goes on underneath that, and like what kind of that deep level, you know, rooted stuff that kind of leads to just that feeling of like, I don't want to be here anymore.
And I'm glad you also mentioned the after part.
Yeah.
Because that's like kind of a whole nother ball game.
Yeah.
But yeah, and some of the things that I experienced before that actual attempt are some of those warning signs and the preventative measures that people need to look out for. Because for me, really, like, my mental health journey started, I was about 12, and it started with a lot of anxiety. I was, like, not going to school anymore, and it's because I had stomach aches, but I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah.
And, like, you know, my parents were like, oh, like, something must be medically wrong if you have a stomach ache every day. So that's kind of how the door got opened. And finally a doctor said, like, have you thought about therapy? Like, I think this might be anxiety. And that was after going to, like, numerous doctors, though. So that's really where it started. And then, you know, the depression kind of came into play, and, like, realizing that's what it was. But like Michael said, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Everyone's depression looks different. Anxiety looks different on everybody.
I think it could be downplayed too sometimes, right? Like,
well, you're 12, you're,
yeah,
you know,
like,
your
oh,
hormones.
you should be happy.
Yeah.
Like, you're a kid. What do you have to worry about? You don't have any responsibilities. Like, we hear these messages that completely just like
negate.
You know, and it doesn't validate the experience that a young person actually might be going through.
Yeah, and like, others also have to be aware and remember that, like, I didn't know what was happening. Like, at 12, 13, like, I didn't know why I was cutting myself. I couldn't express it. I didn't really know. I didn't really understand what was happening. I knew that I knew this was anxiety, so I kind of started learning about that. But I didn't know why I would, you know, go to, like, a family event and want to just run out the door. Like, I didn't understand it. So how was I supposed to express it and then have other people also know what's going on if I didn't, you know? So as I, like, teenage years, and that's the other part, like, oh, she's just a teenager. Like, teenagers act out. They, you know, hormones are changing, like, all of these things. High school's a rough time, and, like, those things are true. But for me, it was much deeper than that.
Right.
Because I was, like, the only one out of, like, my friends that were in and out of, like, the psychiatric hospital.
Right. And I think sometimes we try to, like, group in, like, the teenage experience as, like, one broad thing,
Right.
and rather than, like, each individual is individually experiencing something different in these years of transitioning into, you know, a teenager into adulthood and puberty and all that.
Yeah. So, you know, it started becoming, I think, pretty obvious to me and others that, like, the depression I was experiencing was more than just, like, the teenage struggle.
Yeah.
Like I said, I was the only one going in and out of hospitals. Going to, like, after school programs because I had to catch up on all my homework and all my classwork then. Like, my high school experience was very different than your typical high school experience. So a lot of it was focused on safety, and kind of back to what we were talking about. There's a lot of fear for me anyway. There was a lot of fear in saying, like, these are the thoughts I'm having, because I knew that meant I was going back to the hospital, and then I was going to come home a week or two later, and then what?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of, like I know that, you know, obviously my family's focused on my safety, and, like, if I want to be safe, that's what I need to think about too.
Right.
Like, if I don't trust myself by myself, then there's a safety issue.
Right.
But
I
then
think,
what?
But and to your point of just, like, even mentioning, like, that maybe you don't want to be here or that you want to end your life, and then all of a sudden, like, the trigger being pulled, like, call it, you know, Baker Act, you know, like, how does that impact? You know, like, is that helpful? Like, because it sounded to me like you just said, like, then you were fearful of even expressing how you're feeling when maybe you could have kind of talked through it. But, and I get it from both sides if you're talking to a parent or you're talking to, you know, a teacher or things like that, and people want your safety, but what would be, you know, the best way to kind of, I guess, what would have been helpful rather than that?
I think kind of like Michael was saying too, like, those open spaces to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, I did have people in my life that were supportive and trying to help me. And like I said, I don't blame them because they didn't know, just like I didn't know. But, you know, the fear of, okay, these are the thoughts I'm having, or maybe I was, like, self-harming. Okay, let's go to the hospital.
Right.
You know, and that would then, like, you were talking about the after part.
Yeah.
So, like, each hospitalization after was, like, a whole new, like, okay, now I got to catch up, and people are asking where I was. So it was, like, just this continuous cycle And I lost a lot of friends over it, honestly.
Wow.
Like,
were you able to be honest with your friends about, like, did you feel shame in, like, saying, like, hey, I was just in the hospital for this reason, or like what was that?
Yeah, I definitely there were some like closer friends that knew kind of the struggles I was facing, and some shared in some of those, so it kind of was like I knew they somewhat understood. But I think I only had like one friend that had ever been to like a psychiatric hospital as a teenager.
Right.
But even after my attempt, like I remember coming home from the hospital and having text messages on my phone like, I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore with you. So, and part of me, like at the time, I didn't get it.
Yeah.
Now I can see where it was a lot.
Yeah.
And as teenagers in high school, like they didn't know what to do with that, and it could have been their parents saying, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So like I don't hold that against anyone, and we've
Yeah.
actually talked since then.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of like I know when I walk back into school or come back home to my family, people are going to be asking where were you, and what do I say? Like, oh, I tried to kill myself, like I tried to take my life, or
Yeah.
I was in the psych ward again. Like it was just this cycle, and it does create shame, embarrassment, and that was just from my perspective. Like never
Right.
mind everyone else around me.
Right. And now you're already going through, feeling depressed, feeling all these things. And now, after this attempt, you feel the shame and all that which added to it. And I can't even
Right.
imagine like just the heaviness that created as like a teenager who's like now having to explain all of these
Yeah.
things and feeling that way. And almost probably you almost feel like more isolated.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, my experience was very different than others around me. So I really didn't have people that understood. So that does create like more isolation. I didn't finish high school at school. I went to like a special program because school wasn't a problem for me. I loved school and I had no problem with it. But after the hospitalization, like one time after my attempt, I was in the hospital for like 4 months, and they were trying to have me go to a state facility. But I was an adult now.
Yeah.
I could say no.
Right.
But I had to end up going to like a different program. But there was a lot of pressure from the providers in the hospital to do different things, different types of treatment that I didn't want to do. But it was almost like me saying, like, no, I don't want to do that didn't matter, because then the doctor would come back the next day like, oh, I got you an emergency appointment for this treatment. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I said I didn't want to do that,
Yeah.
So there was also the pressures and the confusion and the fear within the actual treatment system, never mind the outside world.
Yeah. Wow. That's heavy. That's a lot.
I'm listening to what Stephanie's saying because the perspective, I don't want to say it's unique, but it's very different, and it's one that a parent doesn't have, because the question was asked earlier about advice towards parents. One strong piece of advice I would give: once you address the situation and someone's brought in to speak with and help your child work through these ideations or anxieties or whatever it may be, don't be afraid to ask questions. And if it's not working, let them know it's not working.
Yeah.
Because unlike like a bad meal or hiring a contractor to paint your house, you can't look at the situation and say they're doing a bad job unless you talk to your child, get some feedback. And I think that is critical, that you be a part of your child's healing,
Yes.
because it's definitely healing. And unfortunately, we didn't have that opportunity because her therapy sessions only lasted, she was in that type of treatment for, I want to say, 4 weeks. And during that time, when we realized it wasn't working, we brought that to the person's attention. We were in the midst of making changes, but we didn't get to do that. And listening to your perspective, it's very interesting, because the other thing is Alexis was Baker acted, and then when she's brought home, as a parent, you're caught between that place of smothering and giving them freedom. And it's a fine line, because you don't want to give too much. And the other thing is also, by giving too much freedom, it could be misinterpreted as you don't really care.
Yeah.
But by smothering, you don't trust me.
Yes.
And that's a fine line that needs to be discussed, and because adjustments have to be made, like anything else. She might say, in Alexis's case, hey, I'm okay today. I'm good.
Yeah.
And you have to look at your child and trust that they're good.
Yeah.
And some days, use your parental judgment and says, nah, you're not so good today, and we're going to do something else to help you maybe feel better.
Did you have support helping you and your wife like navigate through that? Because that is really hard to find that fine balance of like, hey, we trust you, but we're also here for you, you know, and still as a parent having this fear because you've just gone through this experience and the one thing you want to do is protect your child. So for you and your wife, like navigating through that space, like what helped you to kind of know like, you know, is she good? You know, how much trust do I give? You know, and where do I need to show up?
Her social life was huge at school. During her 2019 was rough for her, but during that time she continued to go to school even after breaking her actors, and she was involved in the swim team. She did water polo. She ran track, and those were all gauges, and you could see the people that she was involved with, the healthy friends, and those were all supporting instruments that helped her get from point A to point B in a healthy manner. And definitely her social network. They were huge. I don't want to, the mental health industry, I'm not a fan of.
Yeah.
And I don't want to speak ill of it. It just didn't work for us.
Can you speak of some of the challenges that you had? Because I think that it's important to kind of talk about that too, of like how do we make the mental health care community better, you know, because it really takes like an initiative from like all aspects of a community, and that, I mean, plays a huge important role in that. So what were some of like the barriers that you experienced?
One huge barrier that she spoke of was when she would interact with someone, if she got the feeling they didn't care, like it was just a job and I'm here to get my hours in, that was huge. And I saw that more times than not. Some people were just not capable of showing. She used the word to me one day. She says, you know, you have empathy. And a lot of people that I interact with on this particular manner don't. And that comes across. And once that's perceived, that the person doesn't have empathy or really doesn't care, then you lose that individual. And they're tapping out. They may not, you know, in their lives, but whatever you said really has no weight.
Credibility,
Or,
yeah.
you're done.
People don't, there's like a saying that people don't remember as much of like what you say as how you made them feel.
Yeah.
Yes.
And people don't really listen until they know you care. So like I think that's huge, especially when we're, you know, providing those services and providing that support. And I think that if we go into like a bigger broad thing of just like looking at to like what is the burnout rate and like, you know, having quality, you know, quality is like the biggest thing, you know, and how do we create quality within our communities so that there is more impact.
The other thing I'd say too is a person needs to be able to relate. And by that I mean Alexis was a 17-year-old kid. She wasn't a kid, she was a young adult. And today with social media and all that's going on, if you bring a therapist in that just can't relate or connect to a child, then that's kind of a non-starter.
Yeah, I think this is why peer services are so important, because like with peer services, like the basis of your relationship is that relatability, right? It's like coming together on this like mutual standpoint of like shared experience of just like, you know, I don't have the exact experience, but you know, this is what I've walked through and I've pursued and been able to find healing, wellness, and recovery, you know, and I think there's this aspect of compassion that's like, man, I don't know, it's just different, you know, like when you've gone through something, like I'm sure parents that have spoken to you after, you know, having this experience, like there's more of a connection that they have with you having lived this and gone through this experience.
The one thing I'll say to that, and we say it all the time, at least I do, when you lose someone to suicide, it's like learning a new language. And many people don't speak that language. And you can tell when someone does because it comes across as very genuine. Not only in what they say, but in their acts. And you, like you said, you may not remember what a person said, but you'll always remember how they made you feel.
Wow, that's good. How has openly talking about your experience played a role in your healing process?
Being able to help others, or at least having them say it was helpful listening to you or talking with you, helped me. Because I live in Alexis's memory. Alexis was different. She was special, smart, kind, and she just wanted to help people. And if I can carry on that and help people not go through what we're dealing with, or at least if they do have to deal with it, understand it a little better or have someone to talk to. It's, you're a member of a club you don't want to be a member of, and it's comfort in numbers in that club.
Yeah, and you're living on her legacy because you're through her, you're able to impact and help other people, which was the heart of Alexis.
Very much so.
That's beautiful. What about you, Steph? How has openly talking about this process helped in your healing journey?
Very similar to what Michael said. And you mentioning the importance of peer work, and that's also like one of your first questions, how my life has changed. Like now I get to do that, right? So I get to, not just right here, but like outside of this room and on a one-on-one basis and in the community talk about it. And can it be uncomfortable still? Yeah, I had some anxiety this morning and just some like a lot of thoughts and feelings, because it is a hard topic. And but being able to talk about it, I know can help somebody else because people have helped me by sharing their experience. So especially, like Michael said, we're part of a club we don't want to be a part of, but I am a survivor of a suicide attempt, so that puts me in a unique position to impact others that are in that club.
Yeah.
Because without that lived experience, I can't relate on the same level. And even though it's because of really hard things that we can relate, we're put in a very special position to be able to help and impact and hope, support other people that are dealing with the same things or have in the past.
Yeah. You both are just so amazing. I feel like so honored just to be sitting in between both of you. I feel like fully inspired and hopeful, and I've learned so much from both of you. I do want to touch on just the stigma associated with suicide and language, and like what role does language play? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, definitely. I learned a lot about that by working in this field, because before working in this field, there was so much I didn't know, and I didn't know that I didn't know it.
Right.
When we use terms like committed suicide, right? It's, to me, like the first thing I think of is like committing a crime.
Yes.
That word commit is just like such a negative connotation, whereas people that have died by suicide, which is like the term that we use, it takes out that like the committing a crime aspect, the such like the negativity and the stigma and the judgment, because someone that dies by suicide or like attempts to, and like in my case, it's not because I was trying to be bad or do harm to people or act out. It was because the place I was in was so dark and sad and hopeless, and I felt helpless.
Yeah.
That's what I thought my solution was.
Right.
So to talk about it like someone should be locked up and put in jail for it.
Right.
Is like it makes like my skin crawl, because people are struggling. They don't.
And even responses like, "Oh, you have so much. Like, how could you do that?" Like those, how could you do
it
this?
Makes
to
it
this
worse.
person? Yes.
Like, thank you.
Like,
I know.
Right.
I know
like,
I have a great family, and I know I have friends, and I know I play sport. Like I know all these things, right? And it changes as like you go through different stages of your life, because that was like at 18, like when I had like that major attempt. But I struggled for years after that, and then being an adult in an adult system in another state, like it is so different at different stages. So, and the treatment in places and the lack of empathy and whatever the cause is, like we could have a whole thing about that. So like I don't want to get fully into that, but just the language and the treatment, it just makes it worse. Like, okay, I went in this place for a week because in my case the ambulance pulled up and off I went, and a week later I'm back home and I'm back to my normal job and school, like back to my normal life as a young adult. But like nothing changed. Someone told, like, I remember sitting in a group and like the facilitator's like, "Oh, you should probably go to like a 12-step meeting." I was like, I know. Like these are, and it's not, like I said, no blame placed on them, because they're doing their job and maybe that's just what the resources they had available.
Right.
But the language and the treatment, like getting out of those situations and then facing it after too, because then like more people know about it. My family finds out even though they're 1,200 miles away. You know, all of these things and the stigma and the whatnot. It just is like a whole. It's almost like a re-traumatization
Right.
after already going through such like a chaotic, sad moment.
Yeah, and then just feeling almost like outcasted in that sense, or
And
judged.
language does that. Language
Yeah,
creates
oh,
that outcasted feeling.
for sure, for sure.
I'm glad you brought up the word committed because having now being a father of someone who died by suicide, I will correct people and because you don't, it's not a crime, like you said. And I didn't understand at first anything about suicide or suicidal ideations until after Alexis was dealing with what she was dealing with. And then after the fact, people will often say that person was a coward. And I'm here to say there was nothing cowardly about the way Alexis died. And I came to understand she wasn't doing this to like harm anybody. It's just the pain she was in and what she was dealing with. So I would definitely, I'm a big fan of, a proponent of educating people as to the language. Because it's huge because the stigmatization that goes with. And some people aren't able to say, you'll be in a room with somebody and they say, yeah, you know, Peter died by suicide or he committed suicide and he was a coward. Some people in the room who are related to Peter aren't built to say anything in rebuttal to that.
Right.
And I do what I can to definitely change that.
Kind of falls on us to be the people that point it
Yes.
out.
Yeah, how so I mean, and that kind of was going into my next question, which is like how can we reduce that stigma and just the stigma around mental health challenges, which would encourage more people, more young people to seek out help.
I would definitely say talk about it and not hide it. And in certain communities and certain heritages or, you know, cultures, it's very difficult to talk about things that happen within your home, especially something as embarrassing or as personal as self-harm may be, or any type of mental health issue. And then, you know, getting an ambulance at your house and then going back to your house, you should feel free. You should feel free to talk about, you know, what's going on and find your safe place to do that.
Yeah.
Because once you create that safe place and you're able to talk about what you went through and what you learned from going through it, you can help others learn.
Yeah.
And I think that's huge. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so I have just in our kind of closing thoughts of, and this question is for both of you. What message of hope or encouragement would you like to share with individuals who may be experiencing thoughts of suicide or struggling with, you know, suicide ideation, and then also for you specifically, parents that are their loved one or their child is experiencing that?
Oh, the first part, as in if they're dealing with it now, don't hide it. And don't be shamed as in your lack of knowledge towards the situation and what you're dealing with. Because keeping it simple, you know, as parents, we don't get handbooks.
Right.
You know, we learn from our own shared experiences, but when suicidal ideations arise, there's no learned experience for that. So find a trusted source to get support from. And if the first source doesn't work or you don't feel comfortable, move on to another one. And be there for your child. Don't talk at, but talk to, talk with. And try to understand, because it's not something where it's not like, you know, your kid scrapes his knee or cuts an arm, you take him to the hospital, they patch him up. When your child is dealing with suicidal ideations, it's a whole different thing. And you have to learn and grow with your child in that new situation that they're now in.
Yeah.
And I had to learn definitely to put my own, I guess, ego and understanding of the situation aside and be willing to learn.
Yeah. And I mean, to that point, I think that we heal together as a family. You know, families heal together. So it's like the process isn't just what your child is going through, it's what you all are going through together as a family unit, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, hope is such a powerful word to me today because I didn't have any, you know?
Yeah.
So I didn't know that this beautiful life laid ahead of me in those moments. And I'm very grateful I got to see them, and I get to see them every day. But it was almost very different, you know? And it's hard to think about. It's emotional. I think about my family, you know, especially hearing from Michael. It's hard. But in those, like, darkest moments, like, one of my biggest things, like, it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling like it wasn't. Like, I had to be okay. But you don't have to be okay. There are resources. You know, I'm not saying the system's perfect because it's not. But, like, there are resources, and there's people to talk to that understand, right? So I much rather someone call me and say, these are the thoughts I'm having, and sit down and talk through it. Because if we can get through, and sometimes the safety factor comes into play and we have to address that, but then let's keep going, right? So after the fact, it's not like, okay, you got help, you're done. Like, there's so much more than that. So, but like when it comes down to it, getting through those moments is crucial. Because I remember in those moments, I couldn't see another way. I couldn't see that there could ever be anything better. Like, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. But like now I'm living proof that there is. So being able to convey that to people, like, even if you can't see it, it's there. And we got to get through that darkness, and it's hard and it's tough and it's absolutely terrible. And there's no right way. So maybe you tried therapy and you weren't a fan. All right, what's next? You know, maybe you haven't tried medication. Let's talk about it. Maybe it didn't work for you. All right, let's talk about that. You know, there's no cookie cutter way to deal with this. And it is healing in all aspects. My family's had to go through, and I'm sure continues to go through their own healing. And, you know, they've given me feedback. You know, I've just heard them say things, and it can be heartbreaking for me to hear, you know? But I'm just so grateful that I'm in a place where I don't give them that anymore.
Right.
You know? But there's always hope. And, you know, as long as there's some, like, glimmer, that, like, that's all you need.
Yeah.
Like, that little tiny speck of light that's, like, there's possibly something past this.
Yeah.
And talk about, like Michael said, talk about it.
Talk about it, yeah. And I think we can all take that responsibility of, like, being a safe space for someone.
Yeah.
You know, I think, like, it literally, like, imagine if every person became a safe space for someone. And that's hard, right? Like, that is a hard call to action, but it is definitely necessary for these numbers to decrease, because one life is too many.
Right.
And I think that there's tools out there. You know, it's not, you don't have to go in it alone or feeling, you know, unequipped, right? I don't think you're ever going to be fully equipped to have conversations like that, but there's things like, you know, mental health first aid for anybody that has dealings with youth, works with youth, is around a lot of youth. There's youth mental health first aid. Like, there are support groups, there are community resources, there's recovery community organizations. Like, there are ways that we can equip ourselves so that we all take on that responsibility of, like, loving each other better. You know, of being a safe space, of being open to having conversations, of being able to kind of walk through, of it not being too much, right? Like, I understand you got the message from your friend, it was too much, but how do we make it not too much?
Like, how do we just hold space for people?
How do we hold space? Exactly. And I think that we can all do better. And that is really what suicide prevention is about. And that would be my call to action for everybody that's listening to this podcast. I also, just before we close, I wanted to say, you know, if you or a loved one are in an emotional distress or suicide crisis, please know that your life matters. You matter. We care about you, and that you're not alone. I mean, as you can see, we have both sides of the coin right here, just sharing their experience, strength, and hope. And there is the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which is available. It's the number 988 24/7 for anyone who needs help. And so with that, I want to thank both of you, because I think that this conversation is so important, and it needs to not just be had on, like, in the month of September for World Suicide Prevention Day, but really, like, every day should be Suicide Prevention Day. And how are we moving as a community to support our loved ones and our young people too, because that's where a lot of the crisis we're seeing in the recent years. So I want to thank both of you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Michael, for being so open to sharing your experience and your pain and your loss. You know, it really, the other side of it is needed. All sides are, like, we need to talk about all sides. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alexis
I want to say, because you brought up two important things that unless you've been there, you don't get it. One is the darkness. And one thing I would kind of, and I don't like the word you use, advise, but I would encourage parents, when the darkness comes, because it will come, be willing to go in there with your child. And the other thing is hope.
Yep.
Never stop. Don't ever give up hope. And sometimes when the darkness comes, hope is hard to find, but it's there. Just latch onto whatever you can and go through it with your child.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you on our next episode of Talking Wellness.
Bye.